Hey everyone, I'm Tammy Salenberger, the author of The One Inside 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about who they are, the different parts of themselves, and for those who want to connect with their true self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
I am super excited to have Dr. Chang here with me today. They have authored one of the chapters in the Altogether Us book project. And so I'm super just excited to get to meet them. And so welcome to the podcast and to hang out with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. So I want to hear sort of start where we always start, which is where you are in the world and what you would see if you looked out your nearest window.
Yeah, so I live in San Diego, California, but today I'm actually in Los Angeles visiting a friend. So it's kind of a perfect mild day here, mild spring day in Los Angeles. There's blue skies. Outside the window, I see palm trees, a big tree with like pink flowers. So it's actually so nice. It's so lovely right now.
Oh, well, I have to say, because I feel like make negative complaints about the New Hampshire weather. So I live in New Hampshire and it is a gorgeous spring day. There's no palm trees outside, but I have hung up my hammock. I live on a river. I can see the river. It's sunny. It's like 75 degrees. It's kind of like the beginning of, it's been just cold and wet and rainy forever, it feels like. So I just feel like I'm going to plant some flowers this weekend. It's Mother's Day weekend. So I'm just feeling like, we survived the winter.
Yeah, that's so nice. I love hearing from folks that I know across the country who are feeling this way. In San Diego, it's mostly like, oh, it's just nice kind of all the time. It rains sometimes, it's a little cloudy sometimes, but overall, it's just so mild. So yeah, I'm happy that you're getting some reprieve.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it feels like it's one of those things that, like, I wonder if you live different places in the world, if you talk about the weather as much as I feel like we do in New Hampshire, just sort of like, but I guess people, and maybe in places that have extreme, I don't think New Hampshire has extreme weather, but maybe people that do have sort of like, we get 6 months of winter. So when it's not winter, it's like, oh my goodness.
Right. Yeah.
So
big deal.
yeah. Well, let's talk about, so your chapter is on, so tell me what your chapter is on, what the title of your chapter is, and then maybe we can start from there.
So the title of the chapter is All Genders Welcome, IFS Therapy with Trans and or Nonbinary Communities. And this was a chapter that is really inspired and based on a lot of the training, workshops, and presentations that I've been giving, including with the IFS Institute conference and with my colleague, Nic Wildes, who is another non-binary IFS therapist. So Nic and I have both we've been teaching a foundational IFS course to queer and trans folks in affinity. And just in conversations over the past few years have gathered this information and have really wanted to make it more accessible to a wider IFS community. And so when I was approached to write this book chapter, I thought this is a great opportunity to just put it down on paper.
Yeah, I love it. And so Nic has been on the podcast too. So for people that have listened to the podcast, it was a long time ago, it feels like. How would you feel about, so Stan, you do not have to answer this question, but it's not on the list, but I am curious about your passion for the subject and what makes, well, sort of a little bit about your story, if you feel comfortable, because I'm nosy and I think all the listeners are nosy. So how would you feel about sharing whatever you feel comfortable with about sort of your own story and what makes this part of your passion?
Yeah, I'm totally open to sharing kind of how this became such a something that I feel so passionate about, something that I devote so much of my time to. I'm like, where do I begin? Maybe I'll just hop around a little because that's how my brain works. And we'll say that I've spent a lot of my career in trans health, specifically in trans health medical systems, and supporting people who are trying to access gender affirming medical care, so hormones, surgery, or just getting help exploring what feels true for them and how they can feel more free to be who they are in the world. And that is very much informed by my own personal experience as a trans and non-binary person, who's been out since 2004, so many years. First came out as genderqueer. And so I think because of my own personal experience and because of my experience with other folks in trans community, many of my friends, loved ones, I really see how much the mental health field is lacking in being able to provide affirming care. And so it's just always been something that I have felt passionate about, which is it's a social justice issue, it's a human rights issue, and it's the kind of training and exposure that most therapists and practitioners don't get exposure to. So then fast forward, I'm working in trans health. Another area of work that I do is eating disorders work, and there's a really big intersection between trans experience and eating disorders, which I can talk more about for oodles and hours and hours and hours, but I won't get too deep in there. I'm going to pull it back now and just say, and then entering IFS, and in this world, you know, prior to this, I was psychoanalytic, I was a DBT therapist, I was an EMDR therapist. And with IFS, it just makes so much sense that we can honor all of these parts and not try to enforce a singular narrative on one person, which society tends to do quite a bit with gender, right? Where we learn from such a young age, there are two boxes. And if I can't look at you and sort you immediately, it's going to create some discomfort. And so we see that for a lot of folks. And there are parts that show up, right? Anger, confusion, wanting to get it right, scared, you know, feeling scared. And so that's one of the reasons why I spend so much time doing this kind of work, as well as DEI consulting outside of the realm of mental health, so that trans people can feel more safe in the world, so that they can go to work and not experience microaggressions every single day. I mean, I can't fix the external systems and environment. However, I can try to help improve access and inclusion. And so let's see, where am I in my story? So IFS training, I really found that there were like little mentions here and there around gender, and some things that I really appreciate, like the current IFS training manual literally does have in there, do not use pronouns for a part when you're working with a client. And that client starts talking about a part, you don't just assume that those parts are all the same as how this person might present themselves today. You might say the part, or ask the part, or tell it, or, you know, see how it's responding. And then if the person starts using a pronoun for that part, you can mirror that back. But that's one of the key tenets of, you know, not sort of imposing a gender binary system onto our part systems. So I noticed that there was some conversation about that, but there wasn't a lot of conversation about trans experience or non-binary experience. And I was looking around for people. Who else is thinking about this? Who else is talking about this? I presented on this at the last in-person conference. I guess this was 2019 in Denver, with my dear friend and colleague Kim Paulus. And so we did this, and then I found out that Nic Wildes had presented on the topic the year before. So we somehow got connected and have become really close colleagues and collaborators. I just feel super grateful for that, because we have this beautiful course that we've created and have been able to kind of take our show on the road, you know, like really try to be able to contribute to the larger community. So am I answering your question? I think maybe, kind of, sort of. And, you know, there are pieces of that are always autobiographical for me, right? Pieces of that include seeking out my own IFS therapy and noticing that I couldn't get very far working with my parts when the therapist I was working with was misgendering me. So I was getting so just sort of caught up in that I actually couldn't do the work. And what I want to say is that it's so common for trans folks that therapists might have so little information that we can never get past. They can never get past getting to the real stuff that someone wants to work on, because these like very foundational things can't get, you just sort of, you experience them as roadblocks.
Yeah. And how do we, thank you for sharing all that. It's great. And I have a zillion questions, but how do we as therapists, like, is it just being more aware or asking more questions? Yeah, what would you say?
Yes, absolutely. Being more aware, being more curious. I mean, really bringing the different aspects of self-energy as much as we can, or I mean, I guess addressing the things that are blocking access to that. And so if we think about what's blocking access to that, a lot of that might be the ways that we were all socialized with the gender binary. We're all told to line up in the boys' line or the girls' line, or to go to the boys' locker room or the girls' locker room. I mean, when we're really young kids, there's no women's room in your house. So, yeah. But we learn that, and it gets so ingrained, and we start believing that there in this gender essentialism, that boys and girls are inherently just so quote opposite. I don't use that term so much, but there isn't a thing such as opposite gender or opposite sex, because it's just different, right? Men and women are different, and that is true. However, not in ways that I think many of us assume are just, oh, is that just wiring? And so, yes, there's all sorts of unlearning that needs to happen. And for that unlearning to happen, we need to have humility. We need to be able to, and it might be very disorienting and actually upsetting or confusing, but ideally we're able to access a kind of humility to say, this is what I have experienced in my life. This is what I have believed to be true for X number of years. But let me be open to the possibility that I've gotten it wrong. Ooh, that's scary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that unlearning, and then being open to learning about folks who exist outside of the gender binary, which, I want to say is not a new thing at all. Trans folks or people outside of a binary system have existed on every continent for centuries. And really Western colonialism, European settler colonialism has played a big hand in erasing even our knowledge of those identities existing, and really enforcing this is the correct way to be. Boys don't cry, act like a lady.
Tell me about this, which I know you said was a big topic, but it's on our list, so I get to talk about it. Tell me about body liberation, eating disorders, de-pathologizing parts that use disordered eating to help someone to survive white supremacist, fatphobic, transphobic culture.
Right. That's a lot of words.
Yes, it's so many words.
It's so many words. So let me see how I want to break this down. You named a lot of the isms. You named a lot of the systems of oppression that I have learned myself. I didn't just know this. Most people, don't have a lot of critical awareness around how we think about bodies. We just think, oh, that's a good body, that's a bad body, that's an attractive body, that's a healthy body, right? So where do we get these ideas? We get them from the air around us everywhere, right? We get it from socialization, we get it from peers and adults. And so much of what we believe about health and about body size is really rooted in colonialism and white supremacy and all the interconnections with ableism, transphobia, homophobia, classism, all those things. But we walk around, or we move around the world thinking this is normal. And so if you have a body that doesn't really fit, into that category of this is a good body. And so this is a good body usually looks like able-bodied, white, cisgender, thin, heterosexual, light-skinned. If you don't fit into that, then you're going to face more minority stress in the world. That's kind of the psychological research term that's often used, but I'll break that down. Just say more stress and more bullshit, right? More stress, more bullshit, more other people's like bias and judgment and discriminatory behavior towards you. If you experience more of that in the world, that adds layers of stress that also necessitate more coping. If I didn't have stress, I wouldn't need to cope, right? I mean, and stress is part of life. And some people have much more in such an inequitable way than others. So, okay, I feel out of control. I feel like this isn't a safe place for me in the world. I need to find some sense of comfort. I need to find some sense of control and security. And a lot of people do then turn to eating disorders or disordered eating, let's say. I tend to want to say disordered eating because eating disorders are such a DSM, such a diagnostic term. And most people who have any kind of disordered eating will never get a diagnosis and therefore never get the treatment that they need. So might turn to restrictive eating, might turn to binge eating, might turn to compensatory behaviors like purging or overexercise, and then get diagnosed, may or may not get diagnosed with an eating disorder, but yeah, and then you're pathologized, right? It's like, oh, what's wrong with you? Versus, oh, that's what you need to do to survive. And what I love about IFS is that it fits so well with that more compassionate and trauma-informed stance of this is not a bad part. Unfortunately, certain parts in the eating disorder realm get pathologized more, right? People hate binge eating parts. People hate on them so much because of their fear of fatness. And I think it is most of the time a fear of fatness, right? So people hate on those. People tend to really love their managers. Ooh, you're so good. You didn't eat that thing, the bad thing, right? So oftentimes we got these managers and these firefighters polarized, if we're going to use IFS language. And so much of the work that I do and that I feel passionate about is how do we make all of these parts welcome and really understand that they're there to help us survive. And sometimes they're not about, oh, I don't like my body. I want my body to look like someone else's body. That's often part of it. But sometimes it's simply, I have no access to food. There's a food desert, food scarcity that is a fact in my life. And I don't know how to depend on my hunger and satiety to orient to food because I don't know when the next meal is going to come. And that is a real big setup for restriction and binge eating. So I could talk about this for a long time, but what I'll say is I do believe that body liberation has many forms and many facets. I'm imagining almost like a fun house of mirrors, although it's not fun. It's not fun. So, but just that, and these things are all tied together, right? Like size liberation, racial justice and liberation of folks who are disabled and neurodivergent, queer and trans folks, all of this is connected. And we do know that folks who are queer and trans and folks of color are more susceptible to developing eating disorders, despite the eating disorder stereotypes that we have out in the world and even in eating disorders treatment.
I love how you explained so clearly about how our parts, those, the protective parts and how they come in and how we, sometimes like some of them more than others, which makes so much sense. How do you feel like this area when you're in a body that doesn't feel like so tell me if I'm saying this right. Like if you're in a body that doesn't feel like it's the right gender, Am I saying that right? Like, so I'm in a body. So how have you seen that, like that worsen, either whether it's like eating disorders, disordered eating, or sort of the just sort of relationship to my body when those mirrors aren't, like the mirrors are just the crazy house of mirrors is just, there's nothing, you know. So I can go to one mirror and be like, oh my gosh, I look so fat. And then I can go to another mirror and be like, okay, that's a skinny mirror. So I'm okay. There's some sort of soothing a part of me can do. But if I'm looking in the mirror and I'm constantly seeing something that feels very different than how I feel inside.
Yeah. I mean, mirroring is complicated and necessary, right? Like I really, if we think about child development, if we think about emotional development, how important it is to be mirrored, have our emotions mirrored, have people see who we are, or recognize who we are. And so for a lot of people, and I don't want to say all trans people because there is no such thing as all trans people, there's no monolith. For many trans people, it's having an experience of having a body that society is seeing and mirroring back, and you know that's not you. So there's a lot of experience of not me. And so there's not me, not me, not me. Or there's that's not me, but I don't feel safe, or it's not safe, or maybe someone in the system is making it very clear that I won't be safe if I express myself in a way that feels real to me. So then people try to mask and contort and make themselves fit into what people want for that. So there's a lot of potential, I don't know, there's a lot of suffering in that. And those are situations that are really ripe for picking up ways of surviving and coping that are life-saving in one moment, and then really harmful and destructive and detrimental in another moment or long term. So I once heard someone say, like, you know, whatever we think of, quote, disorder is whatever helped us to get through the night. So at some point, right, this was for survival. So for folks who feel like, you know, and again, I said not all trans folks, for some people, it's certain aspects of one's appearance. And again, it's not a binary of man or woman, and I have to move from this box to that box. But for a lot of people, it is, I'm not being mirrored, I'm not being recognized. And the world can be a very uncomfortable place in so many ways, and not just uncomfortable, but literally unsafe, right? There's so much violence against trans folks, and there's physical violence, there's anti-trans legislation, which is, you know, it's higher than it's ever been, right? I check the ACLU's anti-trans and queer bills, and it goes up, like, because I do all these trainings, right? So I have to update the numbers, and it goes up every week, you know? So it's really, really painful, really horrible to see this. And so this is not just an imagined, I'm not safe. This is this is not a safe world for so many trans folks. And I want to name, you know, again, not all trans folks, right? Those who are most targeted and marginalized tend to be Black and brown trans women. So we see those intersections of transphobia and racism, right? Those intersections right there. In any case, you know, we do see higher rates of substance use. We see disordered eating, we see depression, anxiety, and these things that I think sometimes are overlapping or intersecting, but not the same as having gender dysphoria. Some of these things do help, though, with gender dysphoria. And when I say gender dysphoria, it is that sense of distress about one's gender, right? Like, I have distress because who I know myself to be is not how my body is, or how my body is perceived. And there's so much that can go into gender affirmation that can actually help. Like, dysphoria doesn't just exist within an individual, it exists within a system. It's if there is something happening, is the distress mine or is it actually systemic? So I guess I just repeated myself. But yeah, so for example, with eating disorders, a lot of folks are talking about trans folks with eating disorders actually having weight and shape control behaviors. And I think that's actually more accurate because there's something that happens when you are using food or exercise or something to try to manage your body shape or size so that you can be more accurately perceived by others in your correct gender, in your affirmed gender. And then the other thought that just came in is that people turn to these things when they don't have access to gender affirming healthcare. It's like, I can't access this. My insurance doesn't cover this. I'm facing all these barriers to getting gender affirming care. Oh, okay, I guess I need to take matters into my own hands for my own sense of peace or survival or safety. So I do think that access to gender affirming healthcare goes a long way in preventing the development of a lot of what we think of as quote disordered, right? Or let's call it like trauma responses or coping. And I do want to say that not all trans people do want gender affirming healthcare. Some people do, some people don't. But the access and the choice is crucial.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just imagining, which I can't imagine, how it is just to even walk out into the world and constantly be getting mirrored, not me, not me, not me, all the time. I mean, and that's just almost like the smallest layer of it. There's so much more layers
yeah,
of it. That's
so
like
many layers, right? So many layers. Like there's the not being seen, there's or perceived correctly. There's just the ways that systems may or may not even acknowledge your existence, right? Like, oh, okay, I want to apply for a job. Oh, as soon as I'm trying to apply, there's a male female checkbox. And then I'm like, oh, what do I do? Or like when I'm in this space, I'll use IFS trainings as an example. Let's say I'm a trans person wanting to go into an IFS level 1. Well, in the current situation, it's a very, very low probability that 2 trans people will end up in the same level 1 training. And so for most people, it's, oh no, I'm the only one. And that's just being the only one, the only person of color, the only queer person, like it just sucks. It just sucks so much. And then trainers may have really wide variation in their capacity and skill to provide affirming spaces. And I do think in order to do that, there's a lot of interrogating of one's own gendered experience and one's own beliefs about gender and the world that is necessary. So there's just a wide range. But again, that's why I feel so passionate about creating inclusive and safer learning spaces within Affinity.
Yeah. I wonder that if we're not even asking ourselves those questions, like, like for someone like me, if I'm not in those spaces, I don't know that I'm even asking myself those questions.
Right, exactly. And, just to reflect that back to you, that is common, right? For people who have the experience of, for people who are cisgender, meaning not transgender, and that, maybe what people have always thought you were in terms of your gender actually matches your own conception. Like, oh, okay, well then of course you're not going to think about it. There's no friction there. There's no tension there. And so then it's so hard for people with a cisgender experience to imagine why gender could be a thing. Right? Like, why could it be such a thing? And why are you talking about it? Why do we care about pronouns? Well, that comes from a place of privilege because, oh, well, I've never had to, so you shouldn't have to either.
Well, and maybe
these are all parts, right?
Totally. Right. Because I'm feeling like it feels like for me, it feels like the one, but not the second one. Like the first one of like, I've never thought about this or I haven't thought about this. Or I had the privilege of not having to think about it. And then I don't think, well, you shouldn't have to, but I think, oh my gosh, that has to be all. It feels like, oh my gosh, that has to be awful to have to. But then I have the privilege of being like, gosh, that sucks. And then that sort of like, and then sort of turning away, like, wow, that's got to be really hard. And then, but then it almost feels like the idea of, yeah, the idea of constantly not being mirrored by even the smallest person as you go to like the grocery store. Like, I think that's where I'm like, wow, like I can feel that. Like, so I'm like, wow, I can't feel like I can, that's where I can kind of like, I can't imagine how painful that is. And that's just, like I said, like the sort of the smallest thing.
And it's additive, right? So like if you witness an interaction in which someone's being misgendered or mistreated because of their gender or being trans, it's likely that that's not the only thing that's happened that day or that week or that month or in their lifetime. Like, it's additive. And so it does create like such a sense of burden. It creates so much that the nervous system is dealing with. I think the kind of hypervigilance that can happen, parts, and I do want to name this, is that, when Nic and I teach, and Nic came up with this question, but we just love using this question in our teaching, is like, is gender a part?
Yeah.
And I think that they talked about that on the episode, which I've heard with you. And we like to ask people, what do you think? Is gender a part? Yes, no, I don't know. And our take is that no, not really. That actually all parts in our system could potentially have a gender. Any one part in our system could potentially not have a gender. And if they do have a gender, they're not always men or women. Some parts could have a non-binary or fluid gender or shifting gender. And that if a client sits in front of me and says, yes, gender is a part for me, I'm not going to argue with them. But I would say, on the whole, we can't just say like, oh, that's my gender part, or that's my, for me, like, that's my Asian part, where I'm like, oh my gosh, like my entire system has experienced being Asian in the world, right? So gender is not just one part. I do think that there are some parts, though, that are more concerned with gender than others. Like, I have a part when I move into a new space and I don't know the people, I have a part that's up. That's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get misgendered. Like, I'm used to this and it sucks. And so I have parts that can be vigilant for that. I have other parts that, have different responses. So I do think that, I have parts that are like, don't make a big deal out of this. Don't bring more attention on you, and then I have other parts that want to come in and educate, I have all sorts of parts that like have responses to experiences related to gender or gender systems. But for me, at least, gender is not one part. And I do have parts that have different genders. And me overall, though, I'm someone who's non-binary and fluid. And that to say, that's the other thing, is that people who aren't trans can have parts of all different genders, right? Like, cisgender people can have parts of all different genders. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're trans or non-binary or have that lived experience. But something I do love about this model is that we can acknowledge that. We can acknowledge that we developed parts that may have different characteristics.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny because as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, I have parts that are different genders. And when I meet them, like, I immediately think about this little boy that I met early on. It's like, when I'm doing therapy, it's sort of playing at my feet with his cars. I was just like, yeah, it's a little boy. Like, it was just so clear. It's a little boy's playing at my feet with his cars. Like, that's just what it was. And so, and then I've also had parts that it wasn't even like, I don't know. And it's not even something about them.
It's funny because we always ask this question, is gender a part? And then haven't actually applied that so much to, like, how does gender relate to self? Like, and yeah, I've been to some trainings, or I don't know where it was, maybe in the conference, where I heard someone talk about neurodivergence and autism and IFS. and they said self is autistic. And I thought that was so like interesting and cool to hear. Like self isn't always just like neutral when it comes to culture. I would say for me, like I'm Asian, like I am so like Chinese, you know, and I wouldn't be like, yeah, I do feel like I am. That is an I am. And so I do wonder about, like, perhaps for some folks, gender is a part, and for others, it does feel much more strongly connected to being an aspect of self.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I like to think about this stuff, you know?
Yeah, and I love that. Like, I love it because it's sort of, there's the openness and there's the, and I've heard that too about autism and sort of, and then, but I love that Dick says like that he invites us just to ask these questions and sort of, and like kind of, we're all kind of figuring it out and talking about it and wondering about it. And like, I love that. Like, I love to, like, I don't know, but let's ask these questions and just have this curiosity about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's
and
great.
That's something I really appreciate about this model and about Dick and those in leadership. And so many of the new folks have moved into leadership, have brought so many compelling questions, and the model is shifting. It's not a static model, it's changing, it gets input. Like, I'm just like, yes. Oh, it's like an organism, you know, that's being exposed to different aspects of the world and different people. And so I love that. I feel like there's just this spaciousness instead of like, this is the right way. This is the right way.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Sort of, this is the way it is that he created, you know, 30, 40 years ago. It's never changed. It's like, yeah, it's complete. It's continuing to evolve. And because it's getting more popular, it's evolving in these like really amazing ways.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about creating affirming spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So tell me about how you're doing that and how you're seeing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that, I guess, I would say that tends to be an aspect of almost everything I do, is because I am existing in a space. When I move into that space, I want that space to feel safe, not just for me, but for other folks, especially folks who have not been centered, folks who have marginalized identities. So this is where I would say formally, that's like where my DEI consulting work is. Informally, it's everywhere, right? It's in like, oh, okay, I'm going to show up in this level 3 training and you know, bring up some, you know, ideas or contributions that might help create more affirming spaces. So there's so many aspects to affirmation and inclusion. So it might be paperwork. It might be built environments, right? Restrooms, elevators. It might be the way we interact with people. One that I think is sometimes overlooked is we can get really caught up in efficiency over people, like relationship. I have a mentor, Desiree Attaway, who says change happens at the speed of relationship. So definitely always interested in looking at what's happening in a relationship rather than that whole like move fast, break things kind of mentality. And yet when I'm working with businesses, working with organizations, a lot of times the mentality is, tell us how to get this really fast. Tell us the right words to use. Tell us what to put on a demographic forms. Tell us, you know, what do we need to do? Should we put some trans people on the cover of a brochure? Like, it's just like, you know, like, tell us what to do, you know? And I think the relational quality is often missing, where we get to slow down and go, wait, oh, there are other humans who are wanting to have a safer experience. How do I touch into my own humanity? How do I touch into my own sense of being gendered in the world and what I've experienced and what I haven't experienced? And so that's really what I'm interested in, and where some of that IFS comes into the DEI consulting, is helping people to connect more and notice the parts of them that have really been inundated, infiltrated by these concepts and norms that are just aren't true for everyone. So I do think of that work as very relational and trauma informed. So yeah, it might be built environments. It's how we, oh, this is where I was going and I got lost, is let's say you enroll for a course and your legal name is different from the name that you go by, the name that feels right and affirming for you. You might hear an instructor say, make sure that in your Zoom name you have your legal name in it, or the name that you registered under. And that's immediately going to feel not very safe or accessible for folks who don't go by the name that's on that chart. So none of this is new. These are things that people are figuring out, have been working on in higher education and classrooms. But there's, because of our learning and socialization around gender, it takes a lot of repetition, a lot. So I do feel fortunate that I get to sometimes bring in something that feels really crucial and foundational, yet really kind of an everyday thing for me, and then interact with someone who goes, I never thought about it like that. Like, those are the moments that I'm like, okay, this is why I do this work, to like help to like kind of broaden conceptions. And like, when that spaciousness like really allows for, I think, everyone involved to feel better, right? And also, like, trans people aren't the only people who experience gender oppression. You know, cis women experience gender oppression. And yeah, I just, unfortunately, the conversation has mostly centered, the conversation about gender oppression has mostly centered cis women. And I don't want to minimize that in any way, because that is real, that's huge, that's across the world, right? And like, I do believe that trans and liberation is for everyone, right? Like, breaking down some of these things that might help us to feel more liberated, it actually benefits everyone.
So you said, and I really love this idea, that the ninth C, we have the 8 C's of self energy, and the ninth C could be community and collectivism. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I want to preface it by saying, like, I don't like own the IFS model. I'm not trying to rewrite it. I don't have a claim to like, I invented this thing. I think people all the time are like, how about this C? How about choice? Choice is a great C. Like, how about this? So, and what Nic and I really felt like we wanted to add / contribute, especially when working with folks from an anti-oppressive lens, is, oh, right, we're not just individuals in a vacuum. And I do think that the sea of connection or connectedness kind of starts to tap into this, but I think it can still keep it in like a dyadic or very small group kind of feel, like, oh, I feel connected, I feel like intimate or, attached, versus when we think about community, we think about collectivism, we think about this care for other people, and we like to think of it as this deep knowing that my liberation is connected to all other forms of liberation. So it's not just me fighting for trans rights, it's me fighting for racial justice, it's fighting for the rights of autistic and neurodivergent and disabled people, and people who experience, you name it, right? So I do think that when I am most connected to self, when I can be in that place, I have a deep care and desire to be in support of and in solidarity with other people, because I'm not burdened by my own, what's happening, like whatever the thing is. And those things are important, absolutely. And I think there's something that's possible when we're able to tap into that like interconnectedness. And so yeah, that's one way that we think about it. So we kind of like, we're like, hey, this is the ninth C. This is how we think about it. And, I do think that in the US, it's a very individualistic culture. And so just to bring in that sense of like, oh, like, what about collectivism? What about like recognizing the humanity in everyone?
Tell me about the course you and Nic are doing, the IFS Foundation stuff, the affinity trainings. Where can people find out all those things?
Yeah. So I'll say, so Nic and I created this training. It's not part of the Institute. The Institute's aware that we do this, and we're also very involved with the Institute. We're both assistant trainer mentees. But in this particular course, what we love is that it is specifically affinity for queer and trans therapists and practitioners. And in this course, we also make sure that it's at least 50% trans and at least 50% BIPOC. So what that means is that ideally no one has to be the only one. And it ends up being a course where I would say the majority of folks are neurodivergent as well. So it's this lovely space with a lot of people who feel like, wow, I've never been to a training before that felt like this. I didn't realize I could shed some of these layers of protection. Wow, my managers and firefighters are like kicking back more than they ever have, and so that's just beautiful. We love doing that. So we're about to start the fourth cohort of that. And so we actually just have a brand new website that we've launched. It's called, it's Queer and Trans IFS. So it's cutieifs.com. So we kind of like that, cutieifs.com. And then also we're getting ready to launch a bunch of workshops. So those will also be on that site. And then my personal website my professional website is sandchang.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Hey Dr. Sand. I don't use it a ton because I have big polarizations around social media, but sometimes I like pop in and say a thing.
That's great. I love QDIFS. That's hilarious. So I just want to say this one more thing about being the only one, because I can't imagine going and being in a room and being like, I'm the only one. And then when you then are in a room and you're not the only one, how that does like kind of let your parts, you might not even realize all the parts that come up to protect you from that feeling until you have a different feeling, which is if we all work on our parts around like building more community and more collectivism and more, if we all do that, then that creates more community. And so that no one ever feels like they're the only one. I don't know. That's probably like Pollyanna of me. I have Pollyanna parts, but
yeah, I mean, and the fact is that sometimes we are going to be the only one, but then can the system recognize that and do what it needs to do? Or can the system prevent us from being the only one and say, actually, let's never have a training where there's a person of color that is the only one here. That is a setup. So, so yeah, I just, I have some Pollyanna-ish parts too, which is probably why I do the work I do when it's so hard. It's hard and there's so many barriers. So anyway, I appreciate you so much for having me, and like I love having these kinds of conversations.
Well, I really appreciate it. So I want to ask the last question before you go, and that is, if you could do anything else and you had to do something else, you couldn't do what you're doing now, what would you do instead?
Okay, I have two answers. So one is that I would just write puns and song parodies, but mostly puns. Like you would just give me a category and I would just make puns and I would get paid for it, because that's pretty much what I do with most of my life anyway. So if I could get paid for it, that would be amazing. And then the other thing is just, I love food so much. So it would be like being like, I say I'm a food top. It's like, if you're like, hey, where's the best place to get Thai food and what should I order? I'd be like, go here, order this. Oh, what kind of food do you eat? What do you not like? Like, I love trying to I'm like a matchmaker. I'm like a food matchmaker. So that would be a great job too.
Yes, I want you to have that job because I feel like I get I get very frustrated when I'm in a new town and like my boyfriend and I are going out to eat and I'm like, I want to eat the best thing. I want to have a good view.
Yes.
I want to have a good experience. And I get like bratty, really bratty parts come up. Because I'm like, well, in this place one time, I want to eat the yummiest thing with the best view and have the best experience.
Then you would, I don't know, not that I want to be an app, but you could in some alternate universe, you would open an app and I'd be like, let me hook you up. Like I have the ideas, like, here you go.
No, I would call you on the phone. I would call you on the phone, or maybe I would text you and be like, hey, you're my matchmaker. Where can we go in such and such city?
Yeah. And that's literally what I do for my friends. So again, if I could get paid for it, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you being open and just letting me, ask questions and be with you. And I really appreciate your presence and your time, and so nice to meet you. Hang out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, like, all the things. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or all the places books are available. You can also visit my website, tammysallenberger.com, where you can download a free meditation on getting to know your should parts. There's parts of you who remind you of what you should be doing. They sound a bit critical at times. Yes, we all have them. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and Twitter and the One Inside Facebook page. I'm so grateful for Jack Reardon, who created the new music. Jack is a graduate of Derek Scott's IFS Stepping Stone program. Thanks, Jack, for getting me. And to you, thanks for listening.